As I say, if you have any questions, just type them into the chat and I'll be glad to answer them. Okay, so here we go. Let me one more person coming in. All righty, so uh, my name is Fred Flancer, as you see, and my company, I'm a tour guide. I've been a tour guide now for about 11 years in New York City. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born on the Lower East Side. I've lived in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens. I live in Manhattan now. I was born in Manhattan. My family was all from New York City, so I'm a dyed-in-the-wool native New Yorker, still in love with the city. All right, let me let another person in. Let a couple more in. All right, here we go. So, as you know, I'm sure, as you signed up for a guided tour of the North Woods from Huddlestone to Glenspan Arch, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful walks in New York City, in Central Park. Central Park is full of beautiful walks. Have you been to the Rambles? But most people have not been to the North Woods. Out of the park's 40 million visitors a year, approximately, only 3 million come uptown to the North Woods. Most people come up as far as, the Imagine Memorial, the Dakota, Bethesda Terrace, but only about 3 million come up all the way to the North Woods. And this gives you an idea if you're not from Manhattan or you're not from New York. This shows you the metropolitan area. Over here, you have Queens, then Brooklyn down here. And of course, and over here is New Jersey. I better not leave out New Jersey. But over here, we have Manhattan. Now, this picture was taken from the International Space Station as it orbited. It was on orbit, about 260 miles up, and it snapped this perfect picture of of Manhattan, etc. You can see every single detail. You can see every single street. Running east, west, north, south. You see absolutely everything. So here, where you see all the bright lights, all of this, well, that's the Great White Way. That is Broadway, Times Square, etc. 42nd Street. And all the way up here by this red arrow, well, that's the North Woods of Central Park. That is in the northwestern quadrant of the park. And this yellow arrow right here, that's where I live. I live on 116th and Lenox Avenue, and that's the way I discovered this northern part of the park that I am so in love with and so enamored with. So I'm going to show you, we're going to do a little fly around of the North Woods here. And you can see it's a heavily wooded portion of the park. It's probably the most heavily wooded of all the park. And you're looking east now, and we're coming around to the south. The lake you see here is known as the Harlem Mere. This is Lasker Pool, which is actually going to undergo a major renovation. But that's another story. It's all going to be torn down and built more to this what Vaux and Olmsted, the designers of the park, would have approved of. And as we come around, you'll be able to see another interesting feature right near, which is called the Blockhouse. It's not part of this tour, but it is a fortification that was built during the War of 1812 to protect the northern approaches of the city from an incursion from the British. Now, the British never showed up. They never assailed New York. They burned Washington, but New York was untouched. And there are 3 other forts in this area. It is known as the Forts Landscape. And next up, we have a map of Central Park. For those people that don't know Central Park, well, let me let somebody in. They've been waiting. Okay. For those people that don't know Central Park, it is 843 acres. 843 completely man-made acres. There is nothing in Central Park that is natural except the rocks, which we're gonna discuss later. But everything else that you see, all the lakes, All the forest, all the hills, etc., are all designed. It is a completely designed, manufactured environment. It's hard to believe. And when I was a kid, I couldn't believe it at all. It took me reading 5 books about Central Park to actually believe that it wasn't natural. And what you see here, I'll give you a little better close up of the area that we're going to explore, which is, again, the North Woods. And we're going to go from here. If you can read this, you can see Huddlestone Arch right here. And we're going to walk along this path, or we're going to virtually walk along this path called the Ravine. We're going to see the lock, and we're going to wind up on the other side at the end of the tour at the Glen Span Arch. And we're going to see beautiful things along the way. Now, I would be remiss in this discussion if I didn't bring in to the discussion these 3 men, Calvert Vaux, Frederick Olmsted, and Jacob Ray Mould. They were the prime designers and builders of Central Park. Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mould built and designed all the structures, the arches, the bridges, etc., in the park. But it was Frederick Law Olmsted that was the visionary. He was the one that saw the need for a park. He saw not only the physical need, but the emotional need of city dwellers to have green space. When he submitted his plan, it was called I think it was called the Greensward Plan. He detailed every single element of the plan. Other people like Veely also submitted designs. I think some of the designs were like on the back of a napkin, something like that. Somebody just drew it out. But Frederick Law Olmsted's plan was detailed to the nth degree. Every tree, every field, every single detail was on his plan. In fact, if you got invited to Frederick Law Olmsted's house, let's say to have supper, the chances were good that he would impress you into service drawing trees on the map, because there were thousands of trees and he couldn't do it all himself. So he'd go over to his house and you would draw trees because he wanted the map so detailed. And of course, he won. How could you pick anybody else? And we are blessed with the fact that he won the competition. It wasn't even really a competition. So we begin our journey through the North Woods. What you see here is the entrance, or I call it the southern entrance. I'm sorry, the northern entrance into the North Woods. When I first discovered this area, when I moved into Harlem about 4 or 5 years ago, I was just walking through the park. I was wandering like I tend to do, I like to walk through the park. And I came upon this arch and I said, oh, gee, this is really interesting structure. I wonder what's on the other side. But before I got to the other side, I had to traverse the arch. And I felt the same way as this quote is. It's a savage and dangerous looking tunnel under which we pass for the first time with not a little bit of inward misgiving, which nothing but our confidence in the skill of the park engineers enables us to overcome. And you can see why. This arch is what was constructed of what is called rubble, even though it's not rubble. What it is, it's rock that was not that carefully dressed. In other words, they created 2 sides that were smooth, but the arch has absolutely no mortar in it. It is held up by friction and gravity, period. And that's why people were saying, oh, I'm not going under there. This thing could collapse on me. Well, the chances of it collapsing on you are very slim. It has stood there since 1866. And I have a feeling if you come back in 100 years, 200, 500, 1,000, if there's no earthquake, it'll still be there. It's a classic design. And Calvert Vaux was a wonderful draftsman, as you see here too. And you see down here, this was 1864, and we're looking from the north side down to the south. It's relatively small, 13 1/4 inches by 16, but he was a wonderful draftsman. And what you'll see here, if you see here this rock, I'll show you where this is in the plan. That's this huge boulder here, which they estimate weighs over 100 tons. And he sheared off the top, and they constructed the arch. And just another aside, it is one of the few arches of this style anywhere in the United States. And it's relatively easy to build an arch. The technology has been around for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. Some genius back in antiquity wanted to get across a stream, and he figured out a way to do it using the local material, which was rock. So the way you do it is you build a wooden falsework, and then you lay your voussoirs, your other stones onto the falsework in the shape of the arch. Your buttresses, of course, you have to build separately. And then you drop in the keystone, right? And then you remove the wooden buttress, and hopefully it stands. Now, I'm sure there have been many times when they pulled the wood away and the thing collapsed like a house of cards, and people were embarrassed. But in this case, it was beautifully engineered. And you can see between the stones, there was absolutely no mortar. The stones are very varied in their shape uh, and size, as you can see. Yet they fit them together. Look at this one. This is a beauty. Look at all the minerals and detail. Yet they used it, and they made aesthetic choices about which stones they would use and how they would fit, and they created this beautiful arch. And you also have to remember another thing. There were no power tools at the time. When this was built, this was basically pickaxes, shovels. They did have blasting powder. Pickaxes, shovels, and brute strength to build something like this. But it was no different than what they did all through antiquity. So now we come to Frederick Law Olmsted's philosophy. And the beauty of the park should be the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures, and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. How many plans get put forward like that, where they're saying, we want to make sure everybody's peaceful and it's beautiful and they can come into the park and they can rest and enjoy the tranquility of this green space? And I should note that Central Park was the very first public park built in the United States. It was modeled after many, many parks all through Europe, and it was also modeled heavily after Greenwood Cemetery. I don't know if people are familiar with Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, but it was the first landscaped cemetery in the United States. And if you get a chance to go to Greenwood Cemetery, that is one beautiful place, and you would really enjoy it, and you would see where Olmsted got his inspiration from. And this is the Huddleston Falls, right after you enter through that beautiful arch. The sanctuary is one of the top bird watching locations in the entire United States. Hard to believe, 3 miles from Times Square. The Audubon Society has named it as one of the top 10 bird watching spots in the United States. And there are 270 species of bird that have been identified in the park. And right now, it is right in the middle of the migration season. So it is teeming with birds. There are nests of robins that I've been keeping my eye on, by the way. And there are eagles' nests. It is just full of wildlife right now and very accessible. This is a rustic bridge, by the way. They call it Rustic Bridge number 32. If anybody come up with a better name, I think they should submit it. So the park, as I said, we've all lived through the pandemic, and we've all sought refuge in different places to maintain our sanity. And I know that my place of refuge that saved my soul, so to speak, was Central Park and the North Woods. There were so many days, you say, "Oh man, how are we going to get through this?" You say, "I go out in the woods, and you can listen to the waterfall and the birds," and it just gave you a sense of optimism, as Olmsted wanted it to be. Now, one of the things about the park, one of the lovely things about the design of the park, not only did they satisfy the physical needs that you had to be in nature, but they also they knew psychologically what made a park successful. I don't know how he knew this, but for instance, when you walk up this path, if you were walking up this path, and this is on one side, on the opposite side of the ravine, the west side of the ravine, you'll notice that the path curves away. So you can see in front of you maybe 50 feet, but beyond that 50 feet, it's a mystery to you. You don't know what's there. And that's the way they designed it. They wanted you to come into the park. They wanted to pick your interest. They wanted you to make sure that there was nothing that when you came in, nothing was going to be given to you in that sense. You had to earn the park. And so if you look around the park, you'll notice there's no paths that are straight, not one single one, except at the mall that goes down from Bethesda Terrace down to what's called the Den Slope at the end of the Literary Walk. That is perfectly straight. It's lined with elm trees, and believe it or not, it's the largest standing collection of elm trees anywhere in the United States. The reason was the elm tree was destroyed by Dutch elm blight, but the trees in Central Park did survive because they're under intense care and scrutiny. So they lived, and they're there. And this is another view through the woods of the North Woods. And what's interesting here, you look at a tree stump, you go, "Oh, a tree stump, so what? Well, what is a tree stump?" Well, this tree stump has historic significance because it's one of the original trees that was planted by Olmsted. Now, when you go in the park now and you see this huge collection of trees, thousands of trees, the assumption is these are the trees that were planted by Olmsted. The answer is not one of them is a tree that was planted by Olmsted. They're all gone. The trees, some of the trees he planted didn't make it. Some of them did, but a tree doesn't last forever. A tree will last 100 years, 125, 150 years. That's it. They're not sequoias. They're not redwoods. They're oak and whatever, but they don't last forever. This tree was blown over in a windstorm. Now, I'm sorry, I want to go back a little bit. I'm sorry. On the evening of Tuesday, August 18th in 2009, and I'm sure some of you remembered if you were in the city, a powerful storm with winds in excess of 80 miles an hour ripped through the park. Central Park, Riverside Park, and Randall's Island, and it damaged 1,500 trees. 500 trees in the North Woods were destroyed. They were just knocked down. They were blown over like they were nothing. And here you see, and they were particularly vulnerable at the time because they were full of leaves. If this might have happened in, November, December, maybe they wouldn't have gone over. But since they were full of leaves, the leaves act like a giant sail, and the trees went over. These giant oak trees went over. You can see it got ripped out right by its roots. And one of the reasons that the trees are vulnerable in the park is they can't put down tap roots because underneath all that soil is the bedrock that the park really is. It's more rock than it is. The soil that you see in the park, the grass, was all brought in. There was no soil really to plant in Central Park when it was first conceived. So it only goes down about 3 feet, and if it's windy, over they go. And that they used the wood, of course. They didn't waste it. It was turned into mulch. There was a mulch pile in the conservatory by the conservatory garden that was literally a block long, a city block long, and maybe 2 stories high of just mulch. There was a lot of trees that were damaged. And you can see that in some places they just left it. You know, trees are a natural, fallen trees are a natural part of the forest ecology. They provide nutrients, they provide habitats for animals. If you're a mushroomer, you know that decaying trees produce mushrooms. And here you can see they just left it, you know, and it looks very much like a natural forest. But as you know, there ain't nothing natural about it. But they're very conscious of what they're doing with the trees, and there are, I think there are 9 arborists that work for the Central Park Conservancy, which is the organization that maintains the park. So trees are very obvious. You know, you have the trees in Central Park. You walk through the trees; they've just changed color. You know, the cherry trees are blossoming. The magnolia trees were blooming beautifully. It was springtime, and the park was glorious. So we know about that. But there's another element to the park that people tend to not ignore, but not to be as conscious of, and that is the rocks of the park, the magnificent structures that Vaux and Olmsted and Jacob Raymold thought would just be fine if they left them alone. And we'll see later through photographs how beautifully the rock integrates into the landscape. And this particular rock that you're looking at, this massive outcropping of rock, is called Manhattan schist. Let me spell that very carefully. Schist, Manhattan schist. Now, it is what is called a foliated metamorphic rock. And what that means is that it's made up not just of one type of rock, but of many types of rock, such as shales and mudstone, etc. And what's happened is about 1 billion years ago or so, as the continental plates were sliding across one another, it generated tremendous heat and pressure, and it blended the rock together. And we get this Manhattan schist, which is one of the hardest substances on the planet. Every skyscraper, every building, practically every building in New York City sits on the bedrock of Manhattan schist. And Central Park is one of the few places where you can really look at it and say, "Oh, so that's what Manhattan is made out of." I call it, you know, I always say, "Where do you live?" I say, "I live on the rock," because that's what Manhattan is. It's a giant rock of Manhattan schist. It's very unique to this area. There's a similar schist actually in Morocco on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But anyway, as again, we have Olmsted to the Board of Commissioners of Central Park in 1858. That's before the park began to be constructed. This is when they're still drawing up plans, because they started building in about 1862, and it took about 20 years. Don't forget the Civil War interceded, and yes, full of schist, Anna. Yes, people say that. That's why I always spell it. But you're right, it is full of schist. So, so in 1858, they're still drawing up plans, right? And the park, as I said, took 20 years, and the Civil War interceded in those 20 years. The United States was at war, and Olmsted went off to war. He worked in the I believe he worked in the hospital corps. He wasn't a combatant. But the time will come, he said, when New York will be built up, when all the gradings and filling will be done, and when the picturesquely varied rocky formations of the island will have been converted into foundations for rows of monotonous straight streets and piles of rectangular buildings. When he's referring to the monotonous straight streets, I guess he wasn't a fan of what was called the Commissioner's Plan. The Commissioner's Plan was promulgated in 1811, which laid the streets of Manhattan out in a grid, you know, so people could buy land, sell land. There were defined spaces. So the famous grid was laid out 1811, 1812. And you can see here, and would have been converted. Well, I lost my spot. There will be no suggestion left of its present varied surface, with the single exception of the few acres contained in the park. And that is absolutely true. It's more than a few acres, though. It's 843 acres. But what he was probably, let's look at this picture first. You see, it's 1861. it's an etching there. There was no photography yet, and this is probably 42nd Street right here, right here, between these two massive outcroppings of rock, which all Manhattan was. The family out for a stroll, little girl playing hoops. This building itself was on top of a rock outcrop in the Hell's Kitchen, which looked very similar in terms of its construction. The buildings on top of the rock outcropping were called rookeries. But the people on the east in Hell's Kitchen were much poorer, probably, than the people on the east side. So here you have 1861. Now, this picture here, it's not obviously Central Park, but I wanted to illustrate. This is on the High Line, right? You recognize the High Line. And these buildings, this is a building that was designed by Frank Gehry. This was Jean Nouvel. This building, I'm not sure who designed it, but if you were to go there now, today, right now, you wouldn't see this view because a massive building has been built in front of it. So it's a never-ending process. There's been a say Manhattan will never be completed, and I think that is probably true. So again, he was very aware of what the future might be. Now, one thing you have to be aware of is that Central Park, when the land was purchased back in the 1850s to build the park, when the city planners decided they were going to build a park for the people and to lure people up to the north, they wanted people to come from the north. 95% of Manhattan's population lived more in the south. North was 14th Street. So they wanted to lure people up into the northern part of the park. The park, when it was purchased, only extended, well, I shouldn't say only, but extended from Herald Square, approximately around 34th Street, up to about 106th Street. Uh, the area from 106th Street to 110th Street wasn't purchased till later, and that's what he's talking about now. He insisted. He said you got to purchase the area from 106th Street further up. Why? Because it seems desirable to interfere with its easy, undulating outlines and picturesque rocky scenery as little as possible. And, on the other hand, to endeavor rapidly and by every legitimate means to increase and judiciously develop these particular individual characteristic sources of landscape effect. He was talking about the area from 106th Street to 110th Street, the area that we're in. He felt that this area, it reminded him of the Adirondack Mountains. He had traveled all over the country. He'd gone west, he'd gone to Europe, he'd gone south, and a lot of the times he just walked and he took meticulous notes. Everything he saw was a note. He was going to use it. There were things that he would write in his scrapbooks and notepads that he would use 30 years later. He would remember. But he kept all these notes. And eventually, and as I said, it reminded him of the Adirondack Mountains. And you have to realize that at the time, people didn't travel around like we do. We get in a car, we get on a train, we get on a plane, whatever it might be, and we go somewhere. Back in those days, people didn't have that kind of money. They weren't going to go up to the Adirondacks with their family, stay for a week, and come back. They didn't have that money. So what Vaux and Olmsted said, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we bring the Adirondacks down to New York? Why don't we make it accessible to everybody? So they did buy the area from 106th to 110th. And as you know now, the park goes from about 60th Street all the way up to 110th Street, where you have a natural boundary. And here again, you can see, they wanted to characteristic sorts of landscape effect. So you see the landscape here. What they did was they brought in soft landscape. In other words, they brought in soil and trees, etc. But that was it. So, by the way, just here, what you're seeing, you're looking towards Fifth Avenue, and this building is now the Cardinal Cook Assisted Living Facility, but it used to be Flowers on Fifth Hospital. And this is, this is Museum Row here, Museum Mile. Now I want to get a little more detail about the rock, and I promise I'll try not to bore you, but it's a major part of the park, and the rock is composed of various minerals, etc., and it's very rich in minerals, as it said in the beginning, a geologist's dream, because everything's on the surface, everything's easy to see if you know what to look at. So it's biotite, muscovite, quartz plagioclase, cannonite, stilomite, garnet, graphite, pyrite, schist. And I said to myself, my eyes glazed over. I said, what the hell is that stuff? So I looked it up. I said, hey, Google, what is biotite? Google's ignoring me. Hey, Google, what is biotite? There she
According
goes.
to Wikipedia, biotite is a
Oh, sorry. Hey, Google, what is biotite?
According to Wikipedia, biotite is a common group of phyllosilicate minerals within the mica group, with the approximate chemical formula K-aluminium silicide O. It is primarily a solid solution series between the iron end-member annite and the magnesium end-member phlogopite. More luminous end members include siderophyllite and eastonite.
Yeah, so I heard that. I said, what? What is that? I'm not a geologist. I don't know what that is. I said, hey, Google. So I said, I've got to get a different angle to this, because I don't want to sit here explaining the geology of it in terms of technical stuff. It's a bore unless you're a geologist. So I said, hey, Google, what is the spiritual value of garnet?
On the website crystalvaults.com, they say, garnet balances energy, bringing serenity or passion is appropriate, and can inspire love and balance the sex drive. Do you want a little more context?
No, thank you. Thank you. So there are many. So I said, oh, there's many ways to approach it. The we know, if we've gone to Red Rock, if you've gone to Yosemite, if you've gone to the area outside of Las Vegas, where native people worshipped at the rock, you know that the stone has tremendous power. And it was true here in New York City with the native people. The people that first populated this island were known as the Lenape, the Lenni Lenape, which means the people. No one knows when they arrived on the island of Manhattan. We do know that Manhattan was a paradise. It had everything that you could imagine. Just to give you an idea, it had the largest oyster beds the world had ever seen. New York was famous for its oysters. The oyster beds covered 200,000 acres, if you could imagine. And the native people ate oysters. They lived off the land. They would migrate up and down depending the season. And they were deeply religious people. And their belief in a creator and 11 lesser gods reached all aspects of their lives. They believed that all things had souls. This reflected a deep reverence for their natural environment and a concept that they were only a small part of nature's grand scheme. This belief made it difficult for them to understand the concept of land ownership and purchase. Now, you remember, well, no, you don't remember, but you read that when the Dutch came in 1609, they bought the land from the Lenape people for, they say $24 worth of trinkets, which is ridiculous, because to the Lenape, they didn't own the land. They felt that, how can we possibly sell what God has created? It's like me selling you the Brooklyn Bridge. So they were glad to do it, but it led to tremendous conflict, because they didn't think they'd turned over ownership. They just felt they were sharing it. But anyway, the reason I'm showing you this particular slide, this particular photograph, is this building, which is called a Patahamonican, is on Weehawken Street to this very day. If you look over here, this is Christopher Street, running east-west towards the river. The river is one block over. This building was actually given to the Lenape Indians by a very wealthy man who was a champion of Native American rights. And when he passed away, he willed this building to the Lenape people. What did they do with it? They ripped out the basement. They got down to bedrock, and it is on the bedrock they carried out their rituals, just like they did for millennia. So it's still here. All of this is still evidence of what goes on and how people worshiped the rock that they lived on. It gave them tremendous power. Now, this is just some beauty shots, I guess you'd call them, of the area around the North Woods. The daffodils have bloomed and gone, as you know. They bloom for a couple of weeks, then they disappear. But the rock is still here and will be for the next millennia, who knows, billions of years as it has been. And it's quite beautiful, the rock. It has beautiful minerals. You see muscovite, biotite, garnet, all little flecks of garnet in the rock. And this here, a tree has buddied up to the rock. Yeah, you don't mind if I grow here, do you? No, jump right in. Yeah, and they puts a root around it, and you can see the way the tree has grown completely into the shape of the rock. You see that out west too. If you've ever been out to the Sequoias and Kings Canyon, you will see sequoias that have done the very same thing with boulders the size of houses, and they drape what they call buttresses over, and it's the same thing. It's an interesting thing to see. And here you see the way they integrated the existing rock into the landscape. They didn't just move it all away, but believe me, this area out here was probably all bedrock too, and it had to be excavated, and that was done. There was no dynamite, there were no hydraulic tools. That was done by pickaxes and shovels and sweat. But they moved it. They moved, I think the number is 100,000 cartloads of material from one side of the park to different areas of the park as they excavated and built. The spoil, as it's called, did not leave the park. It was just moved into different sections of the park to create hills and what have you. And here you see, as the rock emerged from underground at very high temperature, it was immediately, it was underwater. And as it came up, the wave action just cooled it into the shape. So you can actually see in this rock the waves as it washed across it. And this is just a beauty shot, beautiful minerals you can see in the rock all over the place. You can see quartz and what have you. But here, and then we'll get into another subject, but here you can see the striations on the rock. Now you have to realize that the glaciers that came down from the north, they were 2 miles high. Just to give you a sense of that, the Empire State Building is a 1/4 mile high. So the glaciers that came down were 8 times the height of the Empire State Building, and they weighed tons, tons, tons. You can imagine all the pressure on the rock here, and that's what left these streaks, these striations as they're called, as the glaciers scraped across the bedrock. Now you say, well, what does Yosemite have to do with Central Park? We know this is Yosemite, this is El Capitan. Well, the reason that I'm showing you this is because I'm sorry, not Vaux, but Olmsted had his finger in the national parks. Yosemite is considered the mother of all the national parks. And when the National Park Service was being formed, they wanted a mission statement. They called it the National Park Service Organic Act, which was promulgated in 1916. Now, Frederick Law Olmsted was long gone by 1916, but his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., was almost exactly like his father. He was a tremendous architect. He built uh, dozens of parks. In fact, if you go to Washington, D.C., the mall, all of those things are all landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. If you go to Forest Hills in Queens, that was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. So you couldn't imagine a son being more intertwined with his father's legacy. But they asked him to make a mission statement for the national parks, and this is what he said. He said to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner, and by such means I will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. He did the same with the park as well. And so you can go to Yosemite and you can walk up to Olmsted Walk, and from Olmsted Walk, you have these spectacular views of El Capitan and the falls, all in honor of Frederick Law Olmsted, the family. And of course, you've been there and you've seen the falls. Now, I just threw in this photograph here because I was there, obviously, and I took those photographs. I walked down this path here, and I took those photographs of the falls in El Capitan. And as I was walking back to my little tiny Toyota, I looked up and I said, "My God, look at this! Look at this massive outcropping of boulders." And you feel humble. You do. There's no question about it. If you've been out west, you know what I mean. And we're going to get into another aspect of it. And he says, again, with great wisdom, the occasional contemplation of natural scenes increases the subsequent capacity for happiness and the means for securing that happiness. And we know that's very true as well. There is the apex predator of the Northwoods, the red-tailed hawk. There's a Baltimore oriole noshing on a insect, which they do. I can't imagine it without Central Park. This is a black-crested night heron and a hummingbird. We get hummingbirds now. Usually we get them later in the season, but people tell me that they're here now. That's the first time they've come this early. These wonderful photographs were taken by a man named Sundar Jaran, who is just the most incredible wildlife photographer. What you need to be a wildlife photographer is A, patience, lots of it, and technical expertise. And he has both of those. He has patience, though. He'll wait 3 hours to get a shot of a bird, and just taking off. He'll wait. He'll track them down. Talk a little about more him later. That was a terrible sentence. Now you see these chicks here? Very few of the chicks actually survive till adulthood. I have my eye on a nest now that a robin built about 3 feet off the ground. Oh, but here is a cormorant. These are fishers. They can stay underwater 4 minutes. There's a downy woodpecker. There's one in the park that we've named Debbie. I didn't name it myself. I probably would have been Debbie. Anyway, shoveler ducks. Ducks are beautiful. Now, if you want to get in a staring contest with an animal, do not do it with a red tail. They will stare you down. They have no fear at all. When a red tail is in the woods and people see it flying through, everything stops. The bird is completely galvanizing, and the park is a perfect habitat for them. They feast on chipmunks. They feast on Squirrels is a big delicacy, but the thing they seem to like most of all is pigeon. So they feast on pigeon and they do eat rats occasionally, but it's not, their main diet. They have a very varied diet and they're here year round. They don't migrate. The hawks are here year round, as are the cardinals and a few others. Now, what you see here is a quote from Calvert Vaux. It says, nature first, second, and third, and architecture after a while. In other words, they didn't want to interfere with the natural landscape. And when I say natural, you know what I mean. They didn't want to appear to interfere with the illusion of the natural landscape. If you've ever walked through the park, you might see wildflowers, but you won't see any gardens in the park, except when you get to the conservatory garden. But that wasn't built by Vaux and Olmsted. That was built in the 30s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, much later. Vaux and Olmsted had nothing to do with that. They were long gone, but you won't see flower beds. You'll see wildflowers, as I said, plenty of them, but no flower beds. They felt that destroyed the illusion. But they did build architecture when they had to. And what you're seeing here now on the southern side of our walk, we entered, remember, in the north, and we've walked down through the ravine, seen the lock, and now we're at the southern end of the North Woods. This is the Glenspan Arch. And over here, I'm sorry, there's no picture of it, is the Glenspan Cascade, a waterfall that feeds this whole water system. What's amazing here as you walk, and why they built it? Because they wanted to announce, they wanted to say, hey, you're walking here, keep your eyes open. We're going to take you, there's something else coming up. There's something we want you to be aware of. There's something we want you to see that's special. So we're going to take you through an arch into it. Just be conscious of it. So what's really interesting here, and I've done this numerous times when I lead live tours, which we are again doing, you walk down this path here, and as you get about halfway through it, you begin to notice that the sound is changing. It's becoming much quieter and much stiller. You don't hear the sound of the waterfall. If there are cars on the street that you might faintly hear, they disappear. And when you come out on the other side, it's silent. Silent. All you hear is the sound of the birds chirping in the trees. But all the other sounds have gone. Beautiful design. And here you see another shot of another angle of the Glenspan Arch. Now the Glenspan Arch is interesting too. Somebody's waiting here. They came a little late, but I'll let them in. What you see here is what's called ashlar masonry. And now we're actually on the north side of the arch. We came from the south now we're back on the north side of the arch. And what you see here is an arch constructed out of what's called ashlar masonry. And that's spelled Ashlar. And no one knows who figured out how to do this, how to make an ashlar masonry arch. We do know that's been used for thousands of years. Thousands of years. There are ashlar blocks in the structure of the pyramids and on structures in classical Greece. Ashlar blocks made of local limestone and sandstone form part of the Knossos Palace in Crete, built by the Minoans about 2000 to 1500 BC. Later, the Mycenaeans, who lived in the Aegean, used ashlar masonry in citadel walls and castles. And in the Near East, several cultures, including the Phoenicians and Persians, used this method as well. So it is old. Vaux and Olmsted they were not looking to do groundbreaking architecture. They wanted architecture that would blend into the landscape. Except, Bow Bridge was, if you're familiar with the park, there is a bridge, a beautiful bridge called Bow Bridge. That was built out of cast iron, which at the time was quite innovative. Some city planners wanted them to build some kind of suspension bridge, much like the Brooklyn Bridge, which was still under construction at the time, or maybe not, depending on when they built it. But they decided they didn't want to build a suspension bridge because it would be too obtrusive. They wanted something that would blend into the landscape, which it does. So it's the same kind of construction, that we saw earlier with the Huddleston Arch. You can see the keystone, the voussoir, the rig stone, the barrel. Here you see a little more detail, the buttresses we spoke about a little earlier, and a pier which holds the arch tends to want to push the weight out, and that counteracts the force of the arch wanting to push out. So it's a tied arch. And here you can see the beautiful detail. Again, they spent a lot of energy matching the stone, and what you can see. And this, by the way, this area in here is called the grotto. And what you see here is an arch that supports and this arch absolutely contains no mortar at all. It's completely a mortarless arch. But as you look more carefully, you see these lines here. That is the way they fractured the stone. Remember, they didn't have power tools. They would use techniques that were probably familiar to the Phoenicians, to the ancient Egyptians. What they would do is they would laboriously drill a hole into the rock. Then they would insert a wooden dowel. They would drive that in, and then they would soak the dowel. And from soaking the dowel, what happens to wood when it gets wet? It expands. It expands with tremendous force, and that force fractures the rock. That was one way to do it. Another way to do it was brute strength. You drilled the hole, then you put wedges into the hole, and then you drove a pole between the wedges, and that would fracture the rock. So it was a laborious process, and then you had to dress the stone. In other words, you need two flat surfaces at least so the rock can abut together. So you have to do that to a certain tolerance. That was a lot of work too. And they did it though, and it's beautiful. And not only did they make engineering decisions, they made aesthetic decisions. Look at how beautiful this is. Look at the choice of rock, the choice of color. This didn't happen randomly. This was a thought out, carefully engineered ashlar masonry arch that will stand for hundreds of years, I hope. And you can see here they did different things. They rusticated. Rusticated means just what you see. It's not finished except on two sides. And you can see a little masonry in there. They used as little masonry as possible. Now, we're getting to the end of our journey. Andrew Jackson Dowling was really Frederick Law Olmsted's mentor. He learned from Andrew Jackson Dowling. He was really the first landscape architect. And he inspired Olmsted tremendously. And he says, plant spacious parks in your city and loose the gates as wide as the morning to everyone, to the whole people. That's what he wanted. They wanted a park that everybody can enjoy. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be poor. You could come to the park and you could feel like a king. And here are these beautiful landscapes they affected. This particular photograph that you're looking at, I shot from what's called the Den Slope. Now, the Den Slope is on the southern end of Literary Walk. It's just been, it was in the making for about 4 years. What they did was they planted a meadow. Now it's full of wildflowers. You can sit in these benches. It's my favorite bench in the entire park. And this is the view you get. And you can see their use of landscape effect. They used the rock. They excavated, they planted trees. They built gazebos. And this is just a wonderful landscape. Now here, you see what's called the Herndon. This is the Herndon as it's known. Again, a use of rock and trees. This building right here is known as the Ladies' Pavilion, right? Ladies' Pavilion. If you want to get married in Central Park or some kind of thing, if you wanted to have an event, you could rent the ladies pavilion for about an hour or two for 25 bucks. 25 bucks, that's all. You can have it. You can't have a music. I mean, you can't have electronic music. You can't sit down, but you can enjoy the views of Manhattan from the ladies pavilion. And here, you see people using the park as Frederick Law, Olmsted, Vaux, and Mold intended it to be used as a place of refuge, a place where you could sit out and have a sandwich. And this was taken during the plague, actually, during the pandemic, when people were really, hard pressed to find things. And you could see the way they used, again, the sculptural elements that were available to them, the rock. This was all rock. They made aesthetic choices about what they were going to leave and what they were going to remove. I like this one. It looks like they had a little lover's quarrel or something. And here you can see somebody, you needed to be separate from people. You needed to find a place that you could be alone and without fear of contracting the disease. So you could sit and read under a tree and you had your privacy. Everybody understood that. Here you see this gentleman sitting on a bench. These other people up there. They're looks like they're, I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing what they're enjoying. And now we come to the end of our tour. I want to give credit to my friend David Brunetti, who produced the music for me. Music adds a lot. The wildlife photography, as I mentioned earlier, was by Sundar Das Rubenjaran. And if you wanted to see his work, if you really wanted to immerse yourself in his work, which is just spectacular, it's National Geographic quality. You can see his work on divine_photography_NYC, and that's on Instagram, and that is well worth a visit. And the video of the birds and the wildlife was by my friend Ron Lugo. If you wanted to see more of his videos, that's at BirdsRon on Instagram. And this piece was produced by me, Fred Flancer. My company, as I mentioned earlier, is NYC Tours. And if you wanted to get in touch with me for any reason, if you want to take a live tour, it's fred@nyctours.com. And again, this is me. I have my logo embedded in rock. I'd love that, if it lasted a million years or so. And you can reach me at 917-319-5144. And that is it. Okay? If anybody has any questions at all, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask me a question. I'm reading your comments. I really appreciate those. Where would we be without it? I've wondered that endlessly. We had city fathers that were visionaries, and they. This was it was built right after the Tweed ring was busted. There was money, even though. There was a man named Andrew Green who was the controller who kept a very tight thumb on Frederick Law Olmsted. If Frederick Law Olmsted wanted trees, he had to go and beg. He had to beg for them because they were over budget, and he kept a really tight rein on him. In fact, one time Frederick Law Olmsted purchased trees, right? Some trees, I'm not sure which kind. And when they came to the site, they weren't up to his standards. So what he did, he knew that Andrew Green would tell him plant them anyway. So what he did was he mulched them. And then he went to Andrew Green. He said, "Hey, the trees are gone." And Andrew Green was like beside himself, but what could he do? So there was conflict. August Belmont was Parks Commissioner at the time. So there was a lot of interesting stuff that went down. So if there are no questions, and thank you very much for these compliments, I really do enjoy giving the tour very much. I enjoy giving it virtually because we can see things virtually that we wouldn't see necessarily if we were walking through there, but there's nothing like walking through and listening to the sound of the birds chirping. So
I have
if there
one
are no
question.
questions,
Can I ask one question?
sure you can.
Um, the grotto in that last arch that we
Yes.
walked through.
Mhm.
I've walked through it many times, and I always wonder, what was that grotto built for? Because you can't reach it by anything. It's not deep enough to swim
I
in.
think it's just decorative.
It's
Um,
just decorative.
and it allows the water to flow by it. I believe it's just decorative because people have said, oh, it would be nice to have a little restaurant in there or something. But no, I believe it's just decorative.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Fantastic. I
My
learned so much.
pleasure. And it says, you're asking me, how many times do you offer the tour for Jane's Walks? Well, I did it 9 times. This is the eighth one, so there's one more tomorrow night, and then it's done. And like I say, then your only option will be to do it live to really see the North Woods. Of course, you might not see all those animals, but you might be surprised what pops up. The other day we were walking through, and we saw what is it? It's not a badger. It's a groundhog. Groundhog popped up today. Yesterday we saw a raccoon. You never know what birds you're going to see, so who knows what you'll see. But it's a beautiful place. So, with that, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to give the tour, um, no matter whether it's live or virtual. And have a good time and enjoy the park. If you get a chance, get out to Central Park. It is absolutely beautiful. All right. Good night, everybody.